Hello and welcome to the first lesson of the second newspaper set text. This is the Times newspaper, and as I said, this is the first lesson which covers media language and representation. And if you remember from the Daily Mirror, we have a set text for the section A, media language and representation questions for component 1, but not for the section B, but I'll get onto that later. For this session, the learning objectives are to recap really an understanding of the differences between tabloid and broadsheet, something we covered a couple of times so far, but it might feel like a bit of a way back. And also to, of course, analyse media language and representations. We will, of course, be applying the theoretical framework. So as I said, what I want to start with on this session is really a recap of the key differences between broadsheet newspapers and tabloids. And a few things to think about when you are looking or thinking about this is whether or not there are differences in layout and design. Of course there are. The content being different, the difference in audience, if you believe there's a difference, and whether or not they have a different mode of address. So just take a couple of minutes, probably best to go online, find some example copies of tabloids and broadsheets, and just consider the differences between them. Well, of course, to be able to do this, you have to know which papers fall into which categories, and so that's something you should always be aware of. I'm going to use a broadsheet example like The Guardian and a tabloid like the Daily Mirror. Obviously, the nickname of the broadsheet newspapers is sometimes the kind of quality press, and so there's this idea that there is a sort of greater quality or a greater degree of seriousness about broadsheets compared to tabloids, which are considered to be more popular. For this reason, they tend to be aimed at a higher social groupings. So if we look at the NRS model, your broadsheets would be aimed at an ABC1 group, whereas the tabloids, particularly the red top tabloids, are aimed at lower social groupings, C2s, Ds and Es, what we would describe as a more working class audience. But of course we know the NRS model is flawed in as much as it doesn't tell us a lot about the audience other than their income. A tabloid will have traditionally a plainer layout, less colour. I think it was tabloids that first ran with colour. Now, of course, every newspaper does have colour in it, but tabloids tend to be a little more bold, more colourful, more dramatic in terms of the images that they have on the front, whereas broadsheets might have pictures that require a little bit more decoding or anchorage, a bit more subtlety to them, and possibly even smaller pictures with more copy. And that's the other thing, there's a greater copy to image ratio on a broadsheet, whereas images dominate in a tabloid. As for the content of articles, in broadsheets they tend to be longer and more detailed and more serious, whereas in a tabloid, particularly again the red top tabloids, the articles are shorter, they're less in depth, they're not what we would describe as long form journalism, and less serious. So there's a lot more puns and jokes and plays on words in the headlines. There's a lot more focus on human interest stories and celebrity gossip in the stories, whereas in a broadsheet you're going to see more hard news stories, politics, international news, so on and so forth, financial news. And what this leads to is the tabloids using more gimmicks, games, can often feel more like a kind of general interest magazine rather than something that is there to deliver hard news. So there you go, just a very quick recap on those differences. And of course, that's going to come into play and it's going to be important for your analysis. Having spent quite a lot of time looking at the Daily Mirror, moving on to looking at the Times, we should expect to see some of those differences. And you can anticipate those differences when analysing them. But onto the set text, and there'll be no surprises to guess that the newspaper that you're comparing your set Daily Mirror text to features Brexit again. So it's probably a good time to just refresh your memory about the events before, during and after the EU referendum. Have a think to yourself, can you recall the key events? Can you think about how they were represented by the media over time? Interestingly, has that representation changed over time? And does that depend on the medium in particular? So a few questions there to really consider as to whether or not you feel that this ongoing saga of Brexit, which really was going well before the EU referendum of 2016, continues to rattle on in the news despite some quite big stories interrupting it. Has the representation of Brexit changed over time, and is that medium dependent? So is the representation different in the newspapers from it is on the broadcast news? Is social media have a different spin on it? That doesn't have to be ideologically, it can just be with the way it's tackled. So I think one very useful thing to do to help you analyse these two set texts is to have your own portfolio of different representations of Brexit, but make sure you do this from across a range of different media texts. So copy and paste front pages from newspapers, from Google. You can screenshot any memes and viral images that you see on social media. For example, the one I found above of Theresa May trudging around a Mobius strip that obviously she'll never get to the end of. I'm sure it probably felt like that, not only for her, but for a lot of the public as well. So just put together a little portfolio of your own of different representations so that you become adept at analysing different representations of Brexit and become greater at realising that all representations are constructed. And this is the newspaper in question. This is our set text. It is the Times from the same date as the Daily Mirror. But first, before we look at that in a bit more detail, we'll consider a little bit of background contextual information. The Times is, as we said, a British national quality newspaper or broadsheet newspaper that was first published in 1785. So it's well over 200 years old now. It's a very well established and world renowned newspaper with its own history that you need to kind of get your head round in certain ways. Perhaps the most important piece of information you need to know is that the Times has been published by Times Newspapers since 1981, which is a subsidiary of News UK, wholly owned by News Corp, which is Rupert Murdoch's company. This particular edition, just like the Daily Mirror set text, was published on March the 13th in 2019, after Theresa May had encountered another Commons defeat over her own Brexit proposals. Now, the Times, as I mentioned, is a globally famous newspaper with a long history and high regard around the world. It's famous for having a range of journalists with a variety of viewpoints, and this technically or theoretically allows the newspaper to offer more neutral political stance on Brexit negotiations, but you can make your own minds up as to where and how it stands on such issues. But before we look at this in a bit more depth, I'd just like for you to have to think, and hopefully you should have a copy of this single page hard copy or a PDF copy in front of you. What elements of this front cover seem to be the most significant? What jump out at you as being something that we might be analysing, or maybe even contrast, or you could compare with the Daily Mirror cover that we looked at before? Of course, we're going to start with media language analysis, and so I'm going to ask you to initially make notes on the following elements, and there should be really little surprises here. Things like the main image, the framing and the shot type of that image, the use of the body language in the image, the codes of dress and other elements of the mise-en-scène, as well as the actual copy itself and the typography. How has the written copy tried to make a political story less dry and a bit more interesting? What evidence suggests that the paper is maybe trying to take a neutral viewpoint? And of course, a couple of things that we look at whenever we study newspapers. What news values have been employed here to select the stories for the front page? So from that list of about 15 different news values that were employed when selecting stories, things like negativity or currency, size, okay, those kind of things. Which of those values have been employed to choose the stories? And you can look not only at the main story, which dominates this front page, but also the in the news section, where there are another 4 news stories referenced, and of course a Cheltenham Festival pullout as well. And then finally, big question, look at the other stories on this page as well as the Brexit one. What is the agenda? What are the ideologies of the Times? Can you decipher that? What does the Times suggest is important to it? Well, just to help you with some of the analysis and something to make a few notes on if you don't have this already. Of course, when we look at the central image, it's a close-up photograph of Theresa May, obviously looking fairly distraught. There's a sort of pained facial expression, dark rings under the eyes, which of course denote high emotions, possibly a real lack of sleep. If we look at the headline, Driven to Despair, this is anchoring the photograph, making the defeat of her Brexit proposals into something more personal than just a political, factual defeat, something emotional about it. And of course, this is that attempt to narrate what is quite a dry story in reality and turn it into something with more human interest. And it fulfills those news values of personality, where politicians become characters. We might not empathise with them. We even if we don't agree with their politics, there's something kind of humanising about this. Looking at a couple of the other codes here, mentioned the stories below. The in the news stories at the bottom also supplies some sort of global context for the main story. Sort of financial, environmental and travel news are the topics that the Times' audience are interested in. So again, gives you a sense of the values of the newspaper, but also ideologically where it stands. As you'd expect from a broadsheet, most of the print is black on white, which connotes the seriousness of the content. And there is a fashion feature puff box at the top of the page, which is in a sort of paler pastel colour. That's more feminine, maybe less serious, maybe trying to kind of broaden the target audience in some way. And the strapline draws on the Times' long history and reputation as a quality brand, Britain's most trusted national newspaper. This will give readers a range of viewpoints on serious issues, and the heraldic style logo between the words "the" and Times, featuring the lion and the unicorn, which is again world famous, reinforces that idea that it's a quality brand with a long history. So, obviously, one important element whenever analysing media language is to apply some theory. Two main theories we look at when considering media language are Levi-Strauss's structuralism and Barth's semiotic codes. From a structuralist point of view, the way this page is constructed is pretty subtle. There are clues and codes throughout that help us to understand the product as a series of binary oppositions. So have a look for those, read the article, see where maybe we can see that the meaning of the article is defined through setting up a series of binary oppositions. There's quite clearly one really evident there with the yes versus no, those who are in favour of Theresa May's deal and those who are against. But again, there are a few that are a bit more subtle than that. As for Barth, of course, we're looking out for those semiotic codes: referential, enigma, action, semantic and symbolic. Can you find examples of each of these throughout the paper? And, when you're looking for this sort of thing, your analysis will help you. For example, a semantic code, that dark shadow that covers the top right hand corner of the photograph, is quite clearly the shadow of a rear view mirror in a car. Now, something like that could be a semantic code that enables us to understand that she's in a car, whereas it might also be a symbolic code whereby Theresa May needs to look, as it were, metaphorically over her shoulder, to look behind her as to why and who is perhaps betraying her and her trust and her leadership. So, be aware that certain elements can be both semantic and symbolic, can act in different ways. It never hurts to look at a couple of other media theorists when we're considering different media texts. So in addition to the theoretical framework, we can look at other semiologists, like Barthes, the semiologists such as Ferdinand de Saussure, who is, as you can probably tell from the photograph, an earlier semiologist than Barthes. He would obviously interrogate the combination of codes to create meaning. For example, that photograph appears to have been taken through a car window. As I mentioned before, we could see the shadow of the rearview mirror, and that leads on to the driven to despair as a pun. And of course, the connotation of that kind of shot is that it's kind of unposed and often private situations that the photographer has managed to capture. The framing in this suggests a kind of unposed candour to the photo. This emphasises the emotional and personalised framing of the story, so it works hand in hand with the copy. In addition to that, we can take another media language theorist, this time a narrative theorist, because the style, if you read the article, takes a complex political debate and really turns it into a dramatic emotional incident with a sort of recognisable stock characters and narrative elements throughout. For this, we can look at the work of someone like Vladimir Propp, who is more familiar to maybe those who have studied film and recognise his character types. But actually, if you do a little bit of research into Vladimir Propp's 32 narratemes, you'll be able to see certain storylines that Propp predicts from different stories, even appearing in a newspaper front page like this. So of course, media language is just a simple deconstruction of the different codes that make up and create meaning. And so there's just a few theories here that to give you a little help in understanding the meaning of the front page and what is sort of lurking beneath. But of course, always make sure you remember to make the theorists serve your purposes, your own understanding. But as we move away from media language, we will of course then look at representations. And I've dived straight in here with Stuart Hall, who looks at the notion of representations as a construction. And of course, his first 2 points here, the idea that representation is production of meaning through language, with language being defined in its broadest system as a system of codes, and the idea that the relationship between concepts and science is governed by codes. Well, I suppose we can reduce this to the term that the exam board loves to use, that the representation can be seen as a process of selection and combination. And we can prove this by analysing both the copy and the images and coming to a conclusion. So the first thing we can do is just look at the article as a whole and then divide it up into its separate parts. First, consider the article's image. How has Theresa May been represented in this photograph? And second, of course, by the copy itself. Read through the article. How has Theresa May been represented by this article? And of course, by looking at both those things, you could just write down a list of adjectives, a list of words, that you would use to describe how the newspaper has represented Theresa May. And there you go. You've looked at representation as being a process of selection and combination. The editors selected the images, the journalists select the words, and the editor obviously has final say over those words, and that is how representation is produced. But let's return to Hall's last 2 points. The idea that stereotyping as a form of representation reduces people to a few characteristics or traits that are relatively simple or overly simplified. And the second point, that stereotyping tends to occur where there are inequalities of power, as subordinate or excluded groups are constructed as different or other. Now, I don't suppose we're in much doubt that newspapers use stereotypes in their representation. It's clear that they have been guilty of oversimplifying social groups and individuals as well. But we've got to admit that Stuart Hall's last point seems a little strange to apply here, whilst it might, because of course it might seem strange to consider there to be an inequality of power when we're discussing the most prominent politician in the UK. Certainly Theresa May doesn't seem like someone who's been marginalised, having risen to what we might describe as the top job. We can explore how this might reinforce or challenge traditional stereotype representations of women in the mainstream media, though. And that's what we can move our attention to, particularly the work of someone like Lisbeth Van Zunen. What would she say about the representations of women here? So let's have a think about what Van Zunen might say here. I guess we could break this down and say that the photograph of the set text could be interpreted as Theresa May, representing May as a stereotypical woman, someone who is emotional and vulnerable or easily upset. However, the kind of candid and almost invasive framing of the photo suggests that she's allowed her feeling to be shown in private, whereas in public she might be more controlled. This is, after all, what looks like a sort of paparazzi photo. It's interesting this because female politicians often find it challenging to show that they're both strong, capable leaders and caring and warm human beings. One rival MP on the leadership contest that Theresa May eventually won, a rival MP said that May wouldn't make a good Prime Minister because she doesn't have children. Obviously an incredibly sexist thing to say, and incredibly prejudiced or discriminatory. But of course this is an issue that female politicians do face. If they come across as too masculine, on the other hand, they run the risk of losing supporters. Look at the language of the headline, for example, that Driven to Despair. This focuses on May's emotions rather than her political achievements. However, the tone of the article suggests that she's actually justified in feeling this way. In other words, there is an ambiguity here. There is an ambiguous representation of perhaps being weak, but also defiant in the face of adversity. You can add to that is that it's maybe not all negative. Van Zunen might also say that the rarity of representations of women in power means that Theresa May actually be seen as an aspirational figure, even amongst those who don't identify or align with her politics. And of course, something else that Van Zunen talks about in her work is how frequently representations of women differ from representations of men. So finally here, think of some images of male politicians, or even go away and do some research on this for a short while. How do they contrast with representations of female politicians? Well, let's kind of wrap this up with a few ideas, and particularly this may be good practice for Component 1 exam practice and representations questions, because what we can do is look at how Brexit has been represented within the news media, because for more than 4 years the Brexit saga has dominated our front pages across all newspapers, and more often than not this obsession with Brexit is used as a means for pushing the newspaper's own political agendas. Pretty much every paper was either pro-Remain or pro-Leave, with the majority of them being in favour of leaving the European Union. But what this tells us is that representations are not only constructed, but of course they're ideological as well. They're not just there for the sake of it. They don't just use stereotypes as a means of being dramatic or entertaining. They're there to push an ideology. So perhaps from your portfolio, perhaps to start fresh, but find some more examples of newspaper representations of Brexit to prove this point through analysis, that representations are constructed and ideological. And what you'll need to do in your analysis, analyse the main images and the people that are discussed by the front page story. Analyse the language used in the main body of the article. See if the article uses stereotypes either of an individual or of a group of people. And how does that story represent the newspaper's own ideology surrounding Brexit? It will be clear whether it's pro-Leave or pro-Remain, or maybe somewhere in the middle, which is unlikely, but you should be able to get a sense of ideologically what is this newspaper trying to push. Of course, when you're analysing any newspaper, remember that evidence is not just from individual codes. If we're looking at representations, representation is a process of selecting different codes and combining them with other codes. So do a decent analysis of this, and I think you'll find that it makes the set text all that much more easier to understand, and of course you'll be able to compare on contrast with the text that you found yourself. And that's it from Media, Language and Representations. Thanks very much.